let me ask you this. If you were a website owner, would you want people to scrape your website? Would you want people to access your data? Maybe you're Airbnb and you worked really hard to list these products, different information on here. Is it fair that anybody can come and just grab this information and maybe make a copy of your website? Well, not really, right? I mean, it depends. Most of the time, you don't really want people scraping your websites. Although HTML and the data of a website is available to all of us, it's just how our internet works so that people can see different web pages. Most websites don't really want you scraping their data. Now, there's actually a way that websites tell you what you can and can't scrape. It's called robots.txt. We simply say at the end of a URL /robots.txt. If I click enter, look at that. Airbnb has a robots.txt. Robots.txt simply says, hey, if you're a robot, if you're a web scraper or a spider, this is what you're allowed and not allowed to do. Does it mean that they'll prevent us if we break the rules? No, they can't really prevent us. But this is a gray area where you want to be ethical here and only scrape the data that a website allows you. So if we look at robots.txt, you see here that Airbnb has created a text file that tells us what you can and can't scrape. For example, we look at the user agent here, which says the Googlebot. Airbnb is telling, hey, Googlebot, you're allowed to scrape this information, but we don't allow you to scrape account, alumni, calendar, and you see that there's a lot of things that's disallowed. What about Bing SearchBot? Well, Bing, you're allowed to do this, but you can't scrape any of this data. We have YandexBot. What else do we have? We have Baidu Spider. And then we also have user agent star. That means anybody else. Anybody else, you're allowed to scrape this, but none of this information. All right, let's go to another one. Let's go to udemy.com. Here we see that anybody, we don't want you to scrape or crawl through any of this information, but we do allow you to access this API 2.0 course landing components. All right, so that's too bad. It looks like Udemy doesn't really allow us to do anything other than this API 2.0 thing, which we'll come back to. What about Hacker News? We're going to build a project around Hacker News. So let's see if Hacker News allows us to scrape it. All right, so this list is a little bit smaller. We see that for all users, we're disallowed to use these endpoints. So it's saying as long as you don't use these ones, these URLs, we're good to go. That is, if we wanted to scrape just the homepage, which is right here, that's fine. If we're trying to, let's say, go to comments, that's fine too, because this one wasn't in robots.txt. Again, if you remember, if we go to robots.txt, that's fine. The only thing that they ask is that we have a crawl delay of 30. That is, if we're going to crawl their website, we should have a pause so that we don't constantly use programs to hit their website because, well, this is going to overload their servers and maybe slow down their website. So what did we just learn? We learned that there is ethical and unethical ways of scraping websites. Yes, you can scrape any website you want. And as a matter of fact, there's Chrome plugins. If you Google Chrome plugin web scraper, there's a ton of web scrapers that you can use that allow you to scrape websites without even writing a single line of code. It's a good thing to practice ethical programming. And that means checking a website's terms and condition before you scrape it, checking the robots.txt to see what you can and can't scrape. Because usually the data you scrape from a website should not be used for commercial purposes because you're using somebody else's hard work to, well, perhaps make money. And this is why when we went to Hacker News, it asked for a crawl delay of 30 seconds, right? If you're requesting data from a website too aggressively with your program, that's essentially spamming because this may break Hacker News. Now, before we get into web scraping, I want to note one other thing, and that is this idea of an API. If you remember, when we accessed Udemy's robots text, they did tell us that there is some allowed areas that we can scrape or endpoints that we can use. You see, some websites actually allow you to access data. For example, Udemy gives us an instructor API. That is, if you're an instructor on Udemy, you can actually use their API. You can see it right here so that you can get different data. Maybe you can get a course review list, maybe a course questions list. But if I go here and I enter this in my URL, I'll get an invalid missing token. That is because right now I'm not an instructor, or at least I haven't verified that I'm an instructor on Udemy. It's going to say, hey, this data is only for valid instructors. So I need to pass it a token to prove that I'm an instructor on Udemy. And a lot of websites give you what we call API, or Application Programming Interface, access in a form like this called JSON to, well, give you the data that you need. And some websites only allow you to do this if you're a valid user. For example, one of the most popular APIs is this GitHub API, where you can access different information from GitHub. But in order for us to use it, we have to, well, create a user account and validate so that we are who we say we are. But then there's also websites like the Star Wars API that gives us free access. That is, anybody can use it. We don't need to verify that we are a user. We don't have to give a token when making a request. Instead, we can just request data. So for example, if I do the Swappy API and type in people and I hit enter, look at that. I get all this data for free. So that this, well, I can create an app around the Star Wars, which is what Swappy stands for. It stands for the Star Wars API. And we can grab all this information that we want. We also have things like the JSON placeholder, which I really like to use when building simple projects where we can get different information, like photos. You can see here that this is an API that gives us information with different photos that we can use. Maybe we have different posts that we can use. And again, these are what we call in JSON format, which isn't HTML, but just a cleaned up version of data so people can use it. The easiest way to get data from a website is usually using an API. Sometimes websites allow us to just access it easily. Or they might have an API, but it's only restricted to certain users. Maybe you have to register with their service. Maybe you have to pay for their API. Well, in that case, we have this. But then there's also web scraping, which is maybe a website doesn't give you access to an API. Maybe you want to just have that information. For example, Hacker News doesn't offer an API as far as I know. So instead, we might want to just scrape the HTML of the website and see what we can use. So how can we scrape a website using Python? Let's find out in the next video.